The Los Angeles Chargers fired Joe Lombardi after a rough season. Was it his fault? I mean, there were a lot of injuries, but he also ran a lot of all curls. Either way, it's not particularly healthy to dwell on the past, or talk shit about Lombardi on Twitter, which I may or may not have done. Let's just let the next OC decide whose fault it really was. So here's a list of 7 coordinators the Chargers should look into. Before we go any further, if you could just subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. First up, we got Frank Reich, who is definitely the odds-on favorite, though I haven't checked FanDuel, but I'm guessing he is. I feel like some people haven't been too pleased with the idea of Frank Reich, probably because he was fired for a failed high school coach, but that's more of a Jim Irsay problem. He's had a pretty stellar track record as coordinator and coach. Obviously with the Eagles, he won a Super Bowl and somehow got basically an MVP season out of Carson Wentz before he got hurt. That's pretty great. And then with the Colts, he did an amazing job with Andrew Luck for the one season he had him. And he did a pretty good job with Jacoby Brissett. Same with Phillip Rivers. And you could even say he did okay with Carson Wentz. It wasn't that much of a disaster. As for Matt Ryan, that wasn't great. But I think the previous years were obviously a lot more than the 1 year. I feel like he gets a mulligan on that. Most importantly, what's great about Frank Reich is he's shown that he'll just change up his scheme whenever, wherever, just to help his quarterback, which is a pretty rare skill when it comes to NFL coaches. For whatever reason, NFL guys are just very into Xeroxing, which I guess now that I think of it, pretty obvious. It's just easier to just take someone else's playbook and then run it. So in other words, he's the anti-Joe Lombardi. He's not going to just stand by and watch Justin Herbert with his long arms try to do a quick game and have every pass batted down because people can see it from a mile away. Next up, we have Joe Brady. Like Frank Reich, he's got the stink on him. But unlike Frank Reich, it's not totally unfair. Sure, he was there when Joe Burrow destroyed the NCAA that 1 year for LSU. But he also was there in Carolina when Matt Rule happened. With that said, there's still a lot to like about Joe Brady. For one, he's still only 33, so there's the whole he might be Sean McVay thing. I guess because he's young, I don't know, it doesn't really make sense. But that's sort of where my mind goes for whatever reason, because he's showed some aptitude. But then again, he also showed some serious issues with third quarters. Kind of like Lombardi. Actually, a lot like Lombardi. For whatever reason, he too would spam curl plays over and over again, even after they stopped working. I don't know what's up with the Sean Payton coaching tree, because, Payton himself doesn't seem to have a problem with this, but it is what it is. But if you're the Chargers, buyer beware. Next up, we have Brian Johnson, who you probably haven't heard of unless you're a total nerd. And to be honest, I hadn't heard of him either, and the only reason I did is because I decided to look at the Eagles QB coach, because I assumed, he should probably get a job. But after looking into him, he actually seems pretty interesting. For one, his college resume is interesting. He had 1 year at the Florida Gators, but that 1 year was one really high-powered offense from Dan Mullins, which he was the co-play caller of. Also, his short time with the Eagles has coincided with Jalen Hurts entering the MVP chat. Still, that's not much to go off of exactly. And how much credit should he get for what's going on with the Eagles? But regardless, I think he's worth the risk. Shane Steichen, who was obviously the Chargers OC during Justin Herbert's amazing rookie season, he's currently serving with the Eagles, and it'd be nice to see some of that style of offense come back to the Chargers. I, for one, wouldn't mind seeing Herbert throwing 60-yard bombs again. Next is arguably the most controversial one on the list, Jay Gruden. And no, not controversial because of his association with his brother, John, but because he's a retread. He's definitely not the most exciting guy on the list, and his resume isn't even that great. He finished 17th 3 years in a row as the Bengals OC. And his time with with the Washington football team. They're the Commanders now. His stint with them, not great either. But then again, when you think about it, his quarterbacks mostly during his tenures with the Bengals and the Commanders were Andy Dalton and Kirk Cousins. Neither of which are anywhere near as good as Herbert. I know it's not a great selling point to say he'd be better with Herbert, because obviously he would be. But the real reason he's a good candidate is because he runs a style offense that Staley actually wanted. It's the Shanahan-style West Coast zone run. And obviously there's a lot of guys out there running that scheme right now, and a lot of them are younger and more exciting. So the question becomes, do you want someone like Gruden, who you know did pretty well with Dalton and Cousins? Or do you want to go for more of a question mark? Next is maybe the second most controversial guy on the list, Matt Nagy. He's controversial because he screwed up Justin Fields. And by screwed up, he just wouldn't run option plays for him for some bizarre reason. But his resume is pretty good. During his time with the Chicago Bears, he did win Coach of the Year, and he took Mitch Trubisky to the playoffs twice. Though the second time they were 8-8, so it's kind of, but whatever. He did technically do that. He was also Andy Reid's OC in Kansas City during Alex Smith's almost kind of MVP season. With that said, he definitely has his drawbacks. For one, he did not understand what Justin Fields was as a quarterback, to the point where many didn't realize how fast he was until this season. He also has this really weird habit of doing a lot of window dressing just to get a 5-yard hitch route open. So there's a lot of motion and misdirection and weird personnel groupings, but it's not for shot plays or anything that would get you a lot of yards. So yeah, the resume is pretty good, and the connection to Andy Reid you would imagine would be a good thing, but there's something about him that just doesn't seem like he'd be that much better than Lombardi, if not the same, or maybe even worse. Next up is a surprising one, or I don't think it really should be that surprising. It's Pep Hamilton. Pep, of course, was Herbert's QB coach during his rookie season, and he had since moved on to the Houston Texans, where he predictably hasn't done so great. He's also still technically the Texans' OC, but Lovie Smith has been fired, so he's basically going to get fired by whoever gets to coach the Texans for a year next. But I digress. Like Brian Johnson earlier, Pep is a bit of a nostalgia pick. You know, you're hoping for the good old days to come back, which is always dangerous. But for whatever reason, Pep feels like a more dangerous version of Brian Johnson, even though he's had far more experience in the NFL. Then again, a lot of his experience doesn't look great. But then again, when you really think about it, his bad showing as OC for the Texans was because Davis Mills is his quarterback. And he's also coaching for the Texans. So if we ignore his most recent stint and just focus on his time with the Chargers and his time with Andrew Luck, he starts to look like a lot better of a candidate. Next and last is Mike LaFluer, the former coordinator for the New York Jets. LaFluer mutually parted ways with the Jets, whatever that means, who cares, he was probably fired. But regardless, he's available, and a lot of people think he's a great candidate. Which is surprising because his offense wasn't exactly great. And yes, he was saddled with Zach Wilson, but are we sure that's not his fault? I imagine it's not, and Zach Wilson is just not good. But you can't really eliminate that quite yet, which makes me nervous about LaFleur. What he does have going for him is he runs the offense as Staley wants, similar to Gruden. For whatever reason, Gruden seems like an insane pick compared to LaFleur, even though his resume is technically better. But I think with LaFleur, there's room for projection. He did have some flashes where he looked pretty good, and I mean, he made Mike White look competent, and when Breece Hall was healthy, the run game was looking really good. That's it for now, as you can tell. Frank Reich's my top choice, though Brian Johnson's pretty intriguing. I could talk myself into Jay Gruden. Anyone else I'm not so sure about. Pep is kind of interesting, but that's kind of shady too. And who knows, LaFleur might end up making me look really stupid. But I think there's no shortage of good candidates, really. But anyways, thanks for watching and listening. Make sure to like and subscribe, and most important of all, please check out the link, because I actually wrote a longer version of this with more detail. I go into descriptions of their schemes and that kind of stuff, so check that out. Thanks again. Au revoir.